Welcome to the Healthcare IT Today CIO podcast. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. I'm excited to bring you the most practical healthcare CIO insights and perspectives. We know your job is challenging, and we want to help you be more successful. And our guest today is Dr. John Lee. He's founder at HIT Peak Advisors, and he's a former CMIO. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me. Love talking about this stuff.
I feel ashamed that I didn't have you on sooner. I've known you forever, respected so much what you shared, and I'm stunned at my inability to have you on sooner. So I'm glad we finally have you here. Thanks
I'm
so much.
so glad to be talking to you outside of a piano bar.
This is fair. We've been at a few piano bars together, which is fun as well. But
Yes, yes.
yeah, for those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and HIT Peak Advisors.
So I am an emergency physician. Have been an emergency physician for quite some time. I kind of like so many other clinical informaticists in the big initial wave of EMR implementations. I kind of fell into informaticist and eventually CMIO role. Right now, my time is spent doing about a third uh, uh, emergency physician work, a third some IT work, helping out at my home organization, and a third doing consulting work through HIT Peak Advisors. I basically, through HIT Peak Advisors, find ways to use Epic in ways that people may not have considered. And there's a very target-rich environment for that. There's a lot of opportunity that people just don't avail themselves of.
Yeah. Who would have thought that EHR optimization and leveraging the tools that you have would be so powerful? I met a startup guy who said, I'm going to do no software. That was his new company. He said, I'm just going to leverage the tools they already have because everyone has
That
too
is
many
so
tools.
true. I mean, that is so true. I just even um, how many people do you know use Excel basically to create just a matrix to copy and paste and put it into a Word document
Yeah,
when it
some
can do like full out,
explanation.
almost like baby data science?
Yeah, no, that is a good that's a good analogy of where we're
Hmm.
at to some degree is it's the same way we use Excel, that we're not Power Excel users, we're not Power EHR users or whatever other tool
Right,
you want.
right, right, right.
Interesting. Well, I also find it interesting your description of how you started in informatics, because when at that time there probably you couldn't post, oh, I need 3 years clinical informatics experience or
Right, right,
a
right.
clinical
Hmm.
informatics degree. That was how, technology evolved, is that people that had interest and skill and ability just started doing it and
Hmm.
developed the skill.
Right, right, right.
Interesting how that's evolved. But let's talk about something that I think is really interesting, is something we've covered a lot, which is this changing consumer and how the consumer has evolved in healthcare. But how do you see these changes from the consumer perspective? How are they impacting the IT and services that a healthcare organization needs?
Well, I'm I think theoretically I know where we should go. I'm
Mhm.
not particularly optimistic that we'll get there to any sort of with any sort of speed.
Okay.
But my personal opinion is that we should try as much as possible to get to an actual market-based economy in healthcare.
Mm.
And that may kind of rankle people who want single payer, but I think healthcare is too complex to have kind of a top-down, this is something you should do, this is something that you shouldn't do. It has to be much more dynamic, and I personally think that it has to be based on what is of value to you and how much do you want to pay for it. But the problem is that currently the things that are valuable to us, there really isn't a commensurate um, value that we are willing to pay for that particular uh, um, product. So, for instance, I remember seeing a patient in the ED once. This is a true story.
Okay.
She was at a wedding. She was on a table dancing. She twisted and sprained her ankle. Uh, she finished the party and came in after the party and said that her ankle hurt. And I did an x-ray and it was negative. And she demanded that I get an MRI at 2 o'clock in the morning of her ankle because she is a dancer. Now, she made that demand because she like dances professionally. Uh,
Sure.
and and so she made that demand because she has no it doesn't necessarily impact her that yes, if I do that, it would cost her $2,000 to do.
Uh-huh.
She would probably have been more circumspect in making that request if she knew that it cost that much. And on top of that, she had the information and she understood the information that, hey, if we get, even if you do have some sort of horrendous ligamentous tear of your ankle, and then you can no longer dance for 2 years, whether you get that information now or in follow up with an orthopedic surgeon or a primary physician in the next 2 days, it's not going to make any sort of impact.
Doesn't change your care plan.
Right. So it's that, and this is where I that really kind of hits to my core as an informaticist is that those sorts of um, disconnects in the market of the healthcare market and the decisions that we make, both in terms of finances and quality of outcome, are completely opaque to us,
Mm.
or almost opaque to us. The way those decisions are being made right now are essentially uh, through like the payer and payer puppet masters, all these middlemen in the way. And I remember hearing, do you know who Stacy Richter is?
Yeah, of course. Great friend.
Okay. So I remember on her she says multiple times on her podcast, um, where there's margin, or no, where there's mystery, there's margin. And the more mystery you have, the more margin you have.
Yeah.
And the people who are in the midst of change, of figuring out what gets paid for when, they are the masters of mystery.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like, because we had low deductible plans and we
Hmm.
just would pay a copay, we created a culture and a perspective from the patient of I don't have to pay for this. My employer's.
Hmm.
And
Right.
so it made us not care. And now that's kind of changing with high deductible plans and different
Right.
things that are
Right.
happening. But changing that cultural mindset of, well, I'm not paying for it. So what do I care? I just want the best, most care that I can get. Right. Like,
Right. Right. Um, so just as another example, I do you know how the medication rebates work?
it confuses the heck out of me, to be frank.
Okay, let me give you a simple example. Well,
Yeah.
again, where there's
There's a
mystery,
mystery.
there's margin. Okay,
There's a
so
lot of margin.
basically, it's a bribe by pharmaceutical manufacturers to insurance vendors to get their medication on the insurance formulary. So let's say you have a medication that costs uh, $5.
Mhm.
That's the actual manufacturing costs of the
Yep.
medication, including some sort of calculation for the research and development. And then, uh, but what ends up happening is that you mark up the actual wholesale cost from $5 to $50. And then the insurance company then takes that money or takes the payment for that that medication. Let's say, John Lynn, you're taking this medication, and from you as a payer, from your insurance plan, from your self-pay plan, or from your other payer mechanisms,
Mhm.
you pay, say, um, $10. So the insurance company then takes that margin of the 5 to 10, and that's their money. That does not go to the pharmaceuticals. Okay.
Mhm.
And then the insurance company then goes back to you and says, we saved you um what is it? We saved
$40.
you 80%. because the markup cost was $50. So if you think about it, it's basically pharmaceutical pays the uh, insurance provider to get their plan, this medication on the plan, and then the because the insurance company and the PBM sits in the middle, they get to take an extra $10 for doing really not much of anything.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, within these plan documents, it's quite common for uh, the for pharmacy vendors then, like pharmacies, to be they are not allowed to tell the patient, hey, by the way, if you just paid for this out of pocket, it would be $5.
Hmm.
So, and that's that's an overly simplest example.
Yep.
And again, mystery margin.
Well, I mean, what
And
what do we need to do to address this, right? I mean, price transparency has been talked about, and that's a bit of a boondoggle legislatively.
mhm,
Hasn't moved the needle because it's so complex, et cetera, et cetera. Cost plus drugs is doing interesting things around
mhm,
this.
mhm,
But I think it's true as consumers. We want to understand it, but we're being asked to understand a super complex thing when we're dealing with often some of the most tragic health issues that we have, right? Which
sure.
is part of the problem too. So, what should we be doing with these IT, with IT and the services we offer to better facilitate the consumer?
So ultimately, it's again about information delivery, so that the ultimately the employers, who are most commonly the sponsors, health plan sponsors,
Yeah.
and certainly most commonly the health plan sponsors who shell out the most money, they need to know more and be more invested in actually managing these plans. There are HR departments that uh, um, manage these plans. They need to become mini insurance agencies.
Mm.
So they need to know things like, well, we're shelling all this money out for Ozempic. How many of the diabetics on Ozempic are actually have better A1Cs? Or how many diabetics on Ozempic are we actually reducing their overall healthcare spend, and are they spending less time in the hospital?
Mm.
And uh, there's actually legislation that allows for this, but again, the payers are bypassing this, and the insurance, the payers or the health plan sponsors aren't pushing back. So what we need to do is we need to create an information ecosystem that delivers that information in easily understandable terms to both the employers, the self-pay plan sponsors, and also to the consumers, so that it isn't this sort of complex morass on, I don't know if I should get platelet-rich protein, platelet-rich plasma for my knee, or I should get a knee replacement. Which one is better? Which provider is the one who has the most success doing this? And how much does it mean to me in terms of cost? And it should be as easy as me going to ChatGPT and asking a relatively complex question. But now that we have that, it's no longer a treasure hunt on multiple Google searches to find the answer of something that we have to kind of piece together. And I
Yeah.
think that may be one of um, the promises where that sort of technology, being able to aggregate all that stuff together and present it to the end user in an easily understandable and consumable form, is where I think some of this technology will be really, really helpful. And not just the consumer, but also, like, say, a plan sponsor, to be able to say, hey, here's all my data. Uh, I'm thinking about different uh, uh, insurance companies for as a TPA or an ASO. Which one? These are the different parameters. I'll throw one up or throw. These are the things that are important to me. What? Uh, which plan? And which plan administrator is the one that's going to be the most effective for me?
Yeah. It's interesting. I saw someone recently say that we've basically fed the LLM all the knowledge we have, which is super interesting to think about. You know,
Actually, no, that's not true though.
yeah, you don't think so?
It's the only and that goes to some of the data questions
Uh-huh.
is that we've fed the LLM the data that's encoded in
Mm,
the way that we've encoded it.
yeah.
And so that's kind of the big vulnerability and where I think people like us can help out in terms of being able to create better data so that then these other more advanced data science tools can actually do some of the magic that they're promised to do.
Well, and I think that's maybe your point is we need to encode more data so that the LLMs are smarter and produce better
Right.
results. But let's talk about data since we went there. How good is the data in healthcare that we have? Kind of where are we at with data, and what's going to be the impact if we don't improve it, if we just use the data that we have today?
Uh, it's horrible. And I think I remember a few years ago, the percentage of lab results that were encoded to LOINC was somewhere below 10%. I think it's higher now.
Mhm.
I'm confident that it's higher, but I don't think it's actually quite hit 50%. So
Mm.
the simplest thing, these are, these are objectively discrete data points. We haven't even done that.
Yeah, something that is doable.
Theoretically, but it, you know, putting that effort in doesn't actually pay any money. So why
Mm.
bother doing it, especially if you're a provider organization and you're scraping by on sub 1% margins? Are you going to spend your money doing that, or are you going to spend your money trying to scrape extra funds from your revenue cycle?
Mhm. That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting you say that it's bad. Is it bad because the data is, I describe the EHR as a big billing engine. And so we captured a lot
Mm-hmm.
of data for billing. Is that the major problem, or is the major problem that we're capturing the wrong data or in the wrong formats? Like,
A little bit
how do
all
you
of the
look at that?
above, and this actually goes back to what I was talking about in terms of the gaps of how we use in my exam, my personal experience, Epic, but just EHRs writ large. So, for instance, there are ways to document things as a provider. Yeah, you've heard about physicians complaining about being physicians becoming the most expensive clerical workers in healthcare now
Yep.
because we're forcing them to document things discreetly. But there are ways to do it in that are relatively elegant and far more seamless to the end user than popping up something, disturbing their workflow, and say, you got to click these three buttons because we have to collect this data. And therein lies the secret and the value of clinical informatics. But again, unfortunately, that sort of effort doesn't necessarily directly provide an ROI.
Mm. Yeah. I think that's the challenge. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see how things like ambient clinical voice start automating some of that documentation and kind of do a fuller, richer documentation than what was done before. But again,
Well,
you
I
still have
think,
the interruption question.
well, no, and actually there's a risk that that the ambient documentation may make it worse.
Mm,
Because right now we have a lot of people using highly structured notes, and the way that they are structured, they actually help facilitate gathering discrete data.
hmm
Now, if I come in and talk to you as a patient, as a physician talking to a patient, and I just can have that interaction, and Ambient can take it and then basically plop it into my note as just one blob of free text. Now you've actually kind of made the situation worse, although you can then do other stuff on the back end to start extracting data. But actually, one of the things that I've given as feedback to both Abridge and Nuance is that, hey, take some of this. You're already pulling that interaction as discrete data in the background. Why turn it into a note to then turn into more discrete data? Why not take that discrete data that you have processed and actually put it into some say sort of holding bin, some sort of data lake or whatever as discrete data to do interesting things like symptomatic surveillance or
Mhm.
more more semantically rich underlying data substrate. And I think they are working on it. It's just that it again it goes back to what's paying their bills. The thing that is paying their bills is the high profile, shiny object. I, as a physician, can walk in the room, have an interaction with the patient, and boom, my note is done. I'm
Yeah.
done with my documentation.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point. Although I've heard, I've interviewed most of the, I mean,
Hmm.
clinical voice, AI, medical scribe, whatever you want to call it these
Hmm.
days, vendors, and
Sure.
many of them are working towards that, right?
Hmm.
Well, what's interesting is they're in many ways they're putting it back into those old templates that we had forever, which I think has
Right.
pros and cons as well. But you're right, it does need to be the discrete data, or it's
And I and the discrete data has to actually find its way into the transactional database of the
Mhm.
EMR or at least into a data warehouse so that it's fine to have all that discrete data, but those discrete data, there's a network effect. Those discrete data are most impactful if you have it interacting with other clinical data and other revenue data, other operational data.
Sure.
Once you mix them all together, it becomes synergistic, and the sum becomes or the end result is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. It can't just be used to bill. It needs to be leveraged in other
Hmm.
ways. And
Right.
that was a great transition into your use of Epic Cosmos, where you see that firsthand. So those not familiar
Hmm.
with Epic Cosmos,
Sure.
Epic's brought together all the data across hundreds and hundreds of Epic organizations that opted in to share the data, and you can do analysis across all of this data. That's a really simplistic
Sure.
description of it, but you've shared a lot of about Epic Cosmos. We've seen it all. If you follow him on LinkedIn, you've seen it. If not, you should follow John Lee, connect with him, and see. I love it. You see a study, and then you go and say, "Oh, let me see what that says in Epic Cosmos," which is just brilliant. Let's see what the real life data says compared to the study that you found. But how is that changing how you approach leveraging data in healthcare? To me, that's the crazy thing about Cosmos and some of the other things that Epic's doing with that data is it changes how you think about using the EHR and leveraging data. How do you see it kind of changing the work you do and the work of healthcare or clinicians?
Well, so for me personally, one of the things that digging into Epic Cosmos has done is made me far more data literate,
Mm,
and it kind of allowed me to look under the hood and be able to be far more informed in a very granular, detailed sense of where the gaps are in the data that exist
mhm.
in our system. So that's my personal value add. I
So it's
think that
literate in knowing what's there and what's not there, and what the
yeah,
quality of the data is versus the lack of quality sometimes, I imagine.
yeah, and then also going back to the translation piece of what you know, what does an organization say they want, and how does that translate into data? An example is one of my recent posts. I talked about there's this thing called the Charlson Comorbidity Index. Basically, it's kind of a summarization of how chronically sick are you,
Mhm.
and there are different bits and pieces of it. One of them is, does the patient have severe chronic liver disease? Okay, so the person who came up with the Charlson Comorbidity Index, they had an army of abstractors running around collecting all this data, and said, yes, you have chronic severe liver disease. But how does that get? How do you make that machine readable and translate that? And what people don't realize is that you have to, on a granular basis, make some sort of uh, calculation. There's this diagnosis that's encoded into this patient's record under this sort of category, and that diagnosis then qualifies by our definition as severe liver disease. If the patient has one of these thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of diagnoses that qualify as severe liver disease. Then we'll do the check, and that in that scoring system, that then qualifies that person as having an added point or 3 points or whatever on the Charlson Comorbidity Index. And then you multiply that process over all the other different types of decision tools that we have, whether it's the heart score for myocardial event risk strategy, the CHADS-VASc score for AFib and stroke. There's just it's mind-boggling the numbers that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But and I had this conversation with some of my other informatics colleagues, where we can eventually go with this is we can actually bypass some of these tests or these scoring systems that have been, yes, well validated, but they were formulated with the mindset of, hey, these are here are 36 factors that we think are important on on patients. We'll have a bunch of medical students, chart abstractors, whatever, pour through charts, do some sort of checks and put it into an enormous database,
Mm-hmm.
do some calculation to say, of those 36, actually a dozen are the ones that are the most important. And then when we cobble them together in some sort of scoring system, it kind of has a rough approximation of what is risky for that patient, of
Mm-hmm.
whether the patient will have repeated hospital visits or whatever. So if you think about that sort of process, that's what a machine can do, like at multiple orders of magnitude faster.
Yeah, it can do it a
Uh,
million times.
right. But at the same time, you have to have confidence in the underlying data too. And so it goes back. So that's where I think Cosmos can go. I think just based on my conversations with some of the Cosmos leaders at Epic, that's where they want to go. And if you know anything about Epic, one of the things that is their secret sauce is this integration of all their tools.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have a best of breed emergency information system, but Epic's emergency information system is maybe 80% as good as your best of breed. And this
Mm-hmm.
is the sort of calculation that happened in the immediate aftermath of high tech in the early 2010s. But it's fully integrated, and you don't have to maintain any of those interfaces, and it
Yep.
just works. And then on top of that, the data is all mingles really, really well, and you can start making decisions based off that data. So you
Yeah.
shoulder shrug and say, okay, well, it's not quite as good as the best of breed, but you know what? The best of breed is not worth the time and effort. It's great for that little bubble, but we don't live in a bubble, and
Mm-hmm.
we need that full integration. So that's where Cosmos comes into play, in that they are starting to introduce this sort of kind of thinking, being able to take the classic medical knowledge generation, publication, and then actually executing and delivering those sorts of insights so that they actually translate into medical care. The classic number is 17 years. Uh, if you think about how that can work, once you have that all kind of embedded into an Epic type ecosystem, instead of 17 years, you could easily, you know, consider it being done in a few months.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's creating the infrastructure to communicate it in a trusted way. But I think you're right. It's the data that's going to be key to communicating the efficacy
right,
of
right,
the
right.
change. And
Mm-hmm,
and also that data is a lagging indicator in some ways, right? Because the
mm-hmm.
data from the last 2 years is what we did the last 2 years, say a new drug's introduced or whatever. Now we have a month's
John,
worth, right?
John, 2 years. I mean, a lot of these things are decades old. We're
Yeah,
making decisions on
sure.
decades old data.
Yeah. So, I mean, my point is, let's say there's a new drug or a new treatment,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
now of course you could look at just the last month and how does that compare to the previous 2 years and different things like that. but there is a lagging delay in the data being there to be able to make a decision, but it's faster than the 17 years to your point.
Right. Yeah. And actually an example that I've often used to highlight how this could potentially work is Vioxx. Vioxx was approved. Actually, Merck had the data that showed that Vioxx killed patients, but they thought they would still be able to make money on it. So they released it. And it took a good 5 years. Tens of thousands of people estimated died as a result of the Vioxx. Now imagine if we had Cosmos with a Vioxx-like medication.
Mm-hmm.
And then I, as a family practice in the middle of the country, doc, notice, hey, uh, I have 30 patients on Vioxx. 5 of them have had heart attacks. And of those 5, 4 of them don't have any cardiac risk factors. That's odd. Let me go to Cosmos and see what the data
It's
shows.
happening everywhere.
And yeah, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, it's not just me. I need to sound the alarm. So that sort of thing actually did end up happening, but it took 5 years.
Hmm.
But imagine if you could disintermediate that knowledge generation cycle and take 5 years and turn it into 6 months. How many people could you save, and how more quickly can we iterate our medical systems to provide better care?
Absolutely. Well, and I think Cosmos is a great example of one of the biggest challenges we have in healthcare, and that's kind of bridging this communication gap between the clinical and the IT. And I say
Hmm.
Cosmos is the perfect example because it's an IT project, if you will, pulling all the
Sure.
data together, standardizing it, getting it all in there, making it accessible. But it's very much a clinical project where, like an IT person can't look at that and say what's really happening with Vioxx. I mean, we can kind of know that death is
Hmm.
happening, I
Hmm.
guess, but
Hmm.
but there's a lot of clinical questions that need clinical understanding. How do you approach kind of bridging the communication gap between clinical and IT?
Well, I often use the metaphor of the airplane movie from the 70s,
Okay.
where the gentlemen were having very ethnic conversation, and this flight attendant was trying to talk to them, and they were both speaking English, but they didn't understand each other. And Barbara Billingsley comes in and says and helps out and says, "I speak jive." So I speak. So as an informat, and this is one of the prime values of clinical informaticists, is that informaticists speak IT jive to clinical and operational folks, and they speak clinical and operational jive to IT folks. And so there's been any number of circumstances where I have been able to bridge that gap of, well, tell me what your problem is. I remember someone requesting an order set because they just felt like they had to create an order set to solve a particular problem. They described the problem to me, and I said, that order set is not going to solve the problem, but I know something else in the system that will. And it was actually ended up being a much simpler problem, simpler solution. And
Uh-huh.
that's where being able to uh, translate and be able to get people to understand what the system is capable of doing, and also on the operational and clinical side, uh, strategically give them items that will um, help them help the IT folks. Things like collecting discrete data, or being able
Hmm.
to understand that the reason why something didn't work is because everybody's bypassing a particular workflow. Then that workflow, there's something wrong with that workflow. Oh, there are some configuration settings that we can put into place to actually make that easier for the clinical end users to use that, and presto, all of a sudden solve a problem to solve. That's the sort of thing that uh, that we need to start doing, so that IT and clinical and operational don't continue to talk past each other and not understand each other, even though they think that they're speaking the same language.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of my friend Dirk Stanley. I think he's your friend as well. He
Hmm.
said we need more architects
Right.
can help
Yeah.
translate both sides of it, right? What's
Hmm.
possible and what's needed, and bringing those together. Yeah, it's funny. I've been in that room before too, right? Where you speak both languages and you can hear how they're just missing, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like frustrating because you can hear what they're saying and what they're saying, and both of them are right. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like they're
Hmm.
from their perspective, they're sharing what, and so like creating that bridge is hard, but it's so valuable once it happens. And they're like, "Oh, now I understand."
Right, right.
But
I am just dealing with a sepsis quality issue, and one of the comments was, "Well, we need XYZ to happen every time the doctor puts in a sepsis diagnosis." And so my response was, "Well, what's a sepsis diagnosis? Can you define that for me? I don't, you know." And so it's those sorts of conversations that need to start occurring, and so that instead of jumping forward and say these are the things that have to happen um, with a sepsis diagnosis, time out. Let's actually define what a sepsis diagnosis is and have an organizational understanding of what that is before we go to, we have to walk before we run. They want to
yeah,
jump straight or to our AI conversation. Everybody wants the shiny object. AI just does everything for you.
just magically solves it.
But if the underlying data is crap, it's not going to solve you. It's not.
It's going to cause
You're
more
not going to
problems than
get
it
there.
solves.
Yeah, yeah. You're going to be building a house on quicksand, and the house is going
Mm,
to sink and slide off the hill.
yeah, that's interesting. I've often said to people that for a company, it's more profitable to profit from the dysfunction of healthcare than it is to actually disrupt healthcare. I think there's an interesting similar example in IT, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on examples where IT is changing healthcare, is disrupting healthcare as we know it, and examples where we're maybe just paving the dysfunctional cowpaths. For those that don't know
Mhm.
cowpaths, but that we're just paving this dysfunction into our systems and optimizing the dysfunction as opposed to actually changing healthcare. Any examples like that that you know that you know about and that you see and we need to think about and understand.
Well, I would say, I would use the same examples for both, and that's
Mhm.
ambient documentation. There's
Yeah.
no question that ambient documentation is a game changer and really helping to transform how we interact uh, between patients and physicians. But at the same time, there's this fixation that we're creating this ambient documentation to create this note that's this basically a 20th century construct.
Mhm.
Why do we have to have that note? It's because of all the billing and coding and other stuff. And because we have this late 1960s, early 70s paradigm of a soap note from Larry Weed. How about instead we have this interaction and then the data then gets put into some sort of repository. And then when I, as a primary physician, want to recall what happened to that patient, I see what I need to see in context of my mental framework. And then if the patient wants to see what happened, the patient then sees what they need to see,
Mhm.
kind of like five blind men around the elephant. Same elephant, but they
Yep.
see and feel different things because their needs are different.
Mhm.
Uh, but there's no there. I mean, the technology is there to do that. It's just that there's no incentive to do that, and that's what we should be doing. Another perfect example of where we're paving dysfunctional cowpaths is prior auth. Everybody wants to solve the prior auth problem and use AI to collect all the data. So we send it off to the insurance company so that the prior auth process is much simpler. But the problem is that now the or the insurance companies are using AI then to put even more roadblocks up and put other parameters up. And so basically what ends up happening is like a bot war between the provider and the payer prior auth bots. And, is that really serving any, is that really helping? I would say no.
Yeah. It's super interesting, especially your ambient voice perspective, because I think you're right to some degree that we're paving a cowpath, which was the
Hmm.
note. Although
Hmm.
to the credit of some of these vendors in that space, I had one who said we're trying to create a noteless world, which I think is the vision, the latter vision that you described, which is
Hmm. Hmm.
why are we paving these note cowpaths, and why are we
Hmm.
even
Hmm.
thinking about it from that perspective? I think we know the answer is we want to get paid. Turns out most healthcare organizations want to get paid, but then it starts begging the question, is that how we should get paid? Or should we get paid a different way? Or,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
So and I think it's ultimately then it goes to the whole value based
mhm,
versus fee for service. If you are truly kind of nirvana state value based and you're then the note doesn't really matter that much. You just use the note as documentation to help you gather the data so that you can have a truly value based um, uh, construct and ecosystem. Unfortunately, it goes back to some of the data definitions. And the reason, in my personal opinion, why one of the reasons why fee for service, amongst many others, but one of the main reasons why fee for service is still persisting is it's really easy to define.
mhm.
You basically
It's an encounter.
it's an
You
encounter.
get
You
paid
create a
for it.
widget, a coding widget, boom, you get paid. Whereas value, you have X number of patients, and this is what their well, what do you define as quality? Is it
Yeah.
diabetics with A1C under 6.5? Is it diabetics who have foot ulcers? Is it, and it just gets very, very mind numbing very, very quickly. And it uh, I think to a certain point, a lot of people start thinking about it, start going down that path, and then they just kind of they shut down and say, you know what, screw it, we'll
It's
just
not
go back to fee
possible.
for service. Yeah.
Well, and some of it goes back to the data problem again. If we had
Hmm.
perfect data on what your risk was for different diseases and
Hmm.
what different choices would impact that risk, then it would be a very different discussion. But right now, we don't have that data.
Yeah, well, and even in the aspiration of perfect data, how do you define perfect data?
Yeah, yeah,
And one person's perfect data is different than another person's perfect data.
yeah. It's there's art to the science of care
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the human body that's so complex. That's
And another perfect example that both you and I are painfully familiar with is you know meaningful use. The provider organizations will meaningfully use the EHR tech, and basically it was like a paragraph in this massive uh, bill, and that paragraph turned into this massive regulatory bureaucracy of what that definition is.
Mhm.
So, um,
Well, and we are
things that
meaningfully
sound simple
using it.
to yeah, so things that sound simple to decision makers are not that simple.
Yeah. And that's what I've often said about that. The intent was right. We want you
Hmm.
to meaningfully use an EHR that has a certain set of features. At a broad perspective, that sounds reasonable, right?
Right,
And then you get into the details and you're like, well, okay, how can this be abused? Because humans will abuse it.
right. Well, and the flip side though is that as painful and as ugly as that process was, we have a largely digital ecosystem right now.
Mhm.
Yes, we have problems with the data, but at least we have a canvas upon which we can paint. Whether
Yeah.
we want to have Crayola crayons or high-end oil paintings, that's still to be determined. But at least we have that system in place. I talked to some of my European colleagues, and they're actually way behind. I talked to one German colleague where they actually have to a a patient who's discharged from the hospital goes to a clinic follow-up in a clinic across the street in the same organization, and they literally have to print out the patient's records and roll them across the street on a cart to await for them for those records to be visible by the same physician who took care of the patient at the hospital.
Wow. Well, you're 100% right. We have a lot of work to do, but
Mm-hmm.
we've come a long way.
Mm-hmm.
At
Mm-hmm.
least we're not doing the thousands of chart abstractions to do what you do in 2 clicks in Cosmos, right? Like that's a huge progress, even if there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
We like to wrap up these episodes with a little career discussion, career advice, if you will. What would you say is maybe the best piece of advice you've gotten in your career that you could share with others that listening to this episode?
I think an ER colleague of mine once told me, John, you can do anything you want in life. You just can't do everything you want in life.
Hmm.
I have not faithfully followed that advice. I've made myself crazy and my wife probably even crazier because it just I want to be able to do everything and actually that applies directly to IT too because there's you have to do a lot of project planning. There's a lot of Pareto principle that you have to apply. There's stuff that you just have to um, leave by the side, and it's painful because
Mhm.
you can do something, but just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it.
Wow. That's powerful. My mom said something similar in a slightly different way. She said to me, she said, John, you can't do everything. And I heard what she said, and I thought to myself, you know what? She's right. I can't,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
that makes sense. I can't. And then I thought to myself, but man, I'm gonna try.
Yeah,
And I'm not sure, so it sounds like
that's
we're
why
kind
we
of on
get
the
along, John.
same. But that is good advice for me as well to think about, okay, you can't do everything, but what do we want to say no to? That's a powerful idea.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
John, I cannot believe we didn't have you on sooner. I'm grateful that you came on to talk about this. I think people will love this episode and appreciate everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for the CIO podcast by Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcast applications. Thanks, John.
Thanks for having me.